welcome to the History of Chinese Art Part 1. So we're going to start with kind of like some really ancient stuff, and then we're going to work our way through to kind of like the Middle Ages, so kind of the 12th and 13th century. Alright, so we're going to kick it off with art of tombs and temples. So a lot of this stuff is sculptural, mostly because if we're thinking this is a really, really long time ago, so kind of anything that was like textiles or drawings or anything would have a very hard time surviving. So we're going to start by looking off at some things that have been very, very well preserved in tombs, because kind of these enclosed structures are really good for preserving stuff. So it's around for us to see today. So I'm gonna, first of all, apologise for any bad pronunciation I do today. I'm really sorry. I'm gonna give it my best go. So the first thing we're gonna look at is the treasures from Xing Dui, which translates as the star-shaped mound. And this was lots of bronze pieces that were found. So here we've got this lovely freestanding tall man with massive hands, and his face is carved quite interestingly. He's got these really interesting eyes, some quite chiseled cheekbones, very square jaw, massive ears. And you can see this space in his hand for him to be carrying something. And this is quite a very complex bronze cast as well. So these artifacts were discovered in 1929, but they weren't fully excavated until 1986, just because, you know, it's a lot of work. And local people found 2 trenches, so it's big trenches filled with all these artifacts, and they were all deliberately broken. So they'd been broken on purpose, they hadn't just broken over time. They showed signs of kind of real damage, and everything was made of gold, bronze, jade and ceramics. And so particularly these bronze pieces that we can see here, so these are bronze and this middle one's got a bit of gold on it as well. They have been highly complex to make. You would have needed some very complex molds. There's a lot of things called undercuts, which is where you can't just peel a mold off in one way. So that's already quite a complex thing to be doing. I'm really bad at finding undercuts when I'm casting things. And they're quite unusual. I think if you showed me these, I wouldn't immediately be like, oh, these are Chinese. I would have maybe have said South American. Couldn't think, just because of like the curls in the ears, or maybe from Oceania, again with the curls. So these finds have been attributed to the Kingdom of Shu, and people now also call them the people of the eyes, because of the very interesting way all the eyes are in these pieces. And this find really shook up the ideas of what ancient Chinese culture was like, because this style had never been seen before. So I think let's give you a bit of scale. So this middle one, this would most likely have been stuck on a wooden pole, so it was kind of like a bit of the size of a spearhead. And then these two are much, much larger. These are maybe just a bit smaller than a human. They're kind of like, imagine a massive cauldron. That's the size they're in. So a lot of these pieces are really massive and would need a lot of manpower to create. And they don't really know why these pieces were broken. Perhaps it was in sacrifice to gods or something. People don't really know, because it was a long time ago. So there we go. I'm just going to show you a wee map. This is where the Shu were. So this big yellow bit, all of this is modern China, and this light green bit was the Kingdom of the Shu. So it's quite a small section of modern China. And throughout, I'm going to show you maps, because obviously modern China is a modern bit of land. So I'm going to show you which bits we're going to be talking about throughout. So here is, I think, the most captivating piece from this find, and it is this, people call it the Tree of Life, and I'm sorry I couldn't find an amazing picture of it. I think the best one to look at for the shape is this black and white one here, and this is entirely made of bronze. So it's not, if I was going to pick a material to make something in like this today, I probably wouldn't pick cast bronze, because it's a bit of a faff, to be honest. It would take a very long time. I'd maybe go for maybe iron, maybe bending iron, or maybe wood. So it's a very ambitious piece, especially with all these curves. And it's got, so it's this kind of tree sculpture, and it's got all these birds on it, these lovely bronze birds, which are very gorgeous. And they also have little fruits attached in other areas. So people kind of refer to this as a tree of life. And you can see here in this picture, we've got children for scale. So the children are about this big. And it's pretty, so it's pretty big, pretty big. There we go, there's a wee close-up as well. So this is some of the fruit we were talking about. So it's made in kind of sections that kind of lock together. And again, yeah, nobody really knows what that's for, but it's a very interesting piece, especially if it's carving on here. It kind of looks like rope. So that was some ancient bronze. And now we're going to have a look at some ancient ceramics. So you might be familiar with this image. This is the image of the Terracotta Army. So Terracotta Army was discovered in 1973 by 3 guys who were going off to dig a well, and they found a head instead. They were like, oh, what's this? And they went away and reported it to the authorities, and they came back with some archaeologists, because this was known to be the vague area where China's first emperor was buried. So they knew he was buried within this area, but they didn't know exactly where, and they weren't entirely sure how big his tomb was. So the work for the Terracotta Army was begun in 246 BCE, so a very, very long time ago. And it was made for the burial complex of China's first Emperor Qin. Emperor Qin, we're going to go for his tomb room. So that isn't just so that's just the room that his body's in. It's not the entire complex. So he essentially had like a whole mansion built, but his tomb room is thought to be the size of a football pitch. It's pretty massive. So the entire complex is again thought to be 98 kilometers square, which is the size of Manhattan. So that's really, really big. Really, really big. Not sure how that relates to the size of Glasgow, but I imagine fairly similar. So there's also rumours that his mausoleum was surrounded by a river of mercury to keep out robbers, and that has been found that in that area there's some bits of soil with unusually high mercury content. So the army that's been found contains 8,000 soldiers, and it's thought that in his entire burial complex, which hasn't been fully excavated, there are 30,000 pieces made in all. So the Emperor Qin was quite obsessed with living forever, and he wanted people to go and find him a way to live forever, essentially. And at one point he was taking mercury pills, which might have led to him not being very well, because mercury is toxic, and maybe led to him making some of these bad decisions. But he was so obsessed with living forever, he got all these doctors and scientists to try and find a way to make him immortal. And when they failed, he killed them. And it's thought that he killed up to 480 doctors and scientists who couldn't, make his dreams come true. And also his funeral involved the killing and burial of many servants and animals, including all his childless concubines, which is actually, I've been doing a little bit of looking around, and that seems to be fairly normal for a lot of cultures at this time. Woo, go humans, aren't we strange? And the army was buried facing east, because the emperor was really worried about all the people that he had conquered in life having their revenge in death, because he was emperor of a smaller kingdom and then expanded east and took over lots of other smaller territories to make the first kind of kingdom of China, if you want to think of it that way. So he was really worried about the ramifications of that long term. So only the Terracotta Army has been excavated to preserve kind of all the remaining artifacts, because when these pieces are exposed to air, the lacquer work, which we're going to learn about in a bit, can curl and peel off in 15 seconds once it's exposed to dry air, and it just falls off. And that's because kind of when stuff is buried underground, it's in a very specific atmosphere that preserves it. So as soon as you kind of expose it to outside elements, it starts to become damaged. So they haven't excavated the whole complex, because it's really big, and two, because they don't know how to preserve it. So it's a bit like Pompeii. They're not excavating any more of Pompeii until they've got the technology to really look after what they've got. So it's thought that there's a whole palace underneath the ground with kind of servants and maidens and animals and farmers and scribes, all made out of this terracotta. So here's hoping we see that at some point. That sounds pretty cool. So here's an image of some of the warriors. So this is the area that Emperor Qin ruled over. There we go. And this big bit is modern day China. There we go. So if we remember, the Shu were kind of here. Now we're here for Qin. And this is kind of the first dynasty. So that was ruled from 221 to 206 BC. So let's have a look at how these stunning pieces were made. So apparently it took 700,000 workers over the 38 years. So it took 38 years to make, and in that time they needed 700,000 workers to make all of these sculptures. And they kind of did them in a production line basis. So there were kind of 38 foremen who oversaw 100 apprentices who'd be doing the work, and then the foreman would be like, yup, you've done a good job on the legs, now we'll attach them to the body. So it's kind of different people working on different things and slotting them all together. And as we can see here, the bodies were coiled by hand. So kind of, that's the thing, if you've ever done clay making with us and we roll the sausages, except we're rolling really big sausages, and you coil them up and join them together. And it's thought that to create the whole torso would take up to a month. So here's this guy coiling together the torso. The heads, the rough shape was made from a cast. So they'd kind of get a rough shape, and then they would carve in individual details to create the faces. And what's actually really important about the terracotta army is no two of them look the same. They're all completely individual. It's a whole army, and they've got all the different ranks, they've got all the different uniforms to go with that, all the different hairstyles of the different ranks and the different platoons and the different regions, and even down to the faces. The faces show kind of all the peoples of the empire at the time, because obviously it's a really big, massive land. People are of different ethnicities, they look a bit different, and as you can see here, they've got all sorts of different kinds of facial features here. Yeah, so it's a seriously huge undertaking. It's absolutely wild that this was even done, to be honest. And I should say, they're all life-size. They're absolutely massive and made of terracotta clay. So it's quite an operation to get one of these from start to finish without any cracks as well. I'd hate to think how many they had to throw away because they cracked or didn't dry properly, because if any of you have worked with ceramics, you know it's quite a temperamental material. So here we go. So here's a bit more information about them. Here's a few of them standing up. So they also made some kneeling archers, which is really cool. They all just weren't standing up. They did some more elaborately decorated ones who were kind of, you know, more high-ranking officers. And look at some of this detail on this armor. It's just absolutely wild. So here you can see this is how the head is slotted in, naturally into kind of like a bit like a cork popping in the top. I think that's really cool. Yeah. So it's thought that a section of it was looted a while ago, because a lot of the weapons that the army would have been holding are gone, and they didn't think that they would have disappeared without any trace, so they think that they were possibly looted at a later date. And then what is really interesting is I hadn't realised that these guys were painted back in the day. So this is what we are left with all their lacquers come off. But this is how they would have been painted originally. These have been restored. So it's lacquer is an egg-based paint that's mixed with different colours and applied over 2 layers. And And this would have been an incredibly expensive process at the time. To have anything made of lacquer ware denoted that you were very high status, and it wasn't cheap to come by. So the fact that this guy is getting all of these life-size models painted with lacquer is just absolutely ludicrous. I don't think we could even put a number on how much that would cost, and it just goes to show that this wasn't a rational decision, or a kind of a not a rational decision, but it wasn't like a economically driven decision. This was a kind of an emperor being like, right, you are doing this for me now. So here you can see some of the different things that they would have used to colour the lacquer. So you've got red cinnabar, which is I think a kind of tree, charcoal. They made the purple by combining some of the cinnabar with barium copper silicate, whatever that was. We've got some blue azurite, that's kind of rock. Dark red, that's iron oxide. We still use that in some pottery today. White, you would get that from burning bones at a very high temperature, so probably cattle bones. And then the green is malachite, which is again a kind of rock. So I think it's just amazing to see how richly decorated these are. I think it would be fabulous to be able to see one in real life. Really cool. I think it's also worth mentioning the craftsmen who didn't do a good job, so the foremen that were overseeing their apprentices doing the work. The punishment was death for them if they didn't do their job properly, you know, so this wasn't a trivial project. It needed to be done properly. The stakes were high. So this guy's a general. Looks pretty cool, it's very fancy. Purple probably being quite expensive as well, I imagine. And then this is what I think is really cool. So alongside the army, they found two fully working bronze chariots that they kind of were in bits and they've kind of put back together. And this is one of the fully restored ones. So there's this one with a chariot and an umbrella, and then there was another one with kind of a wagon attached. And to this day, they are still the most complex bronze sculptures ever made, which is just wild because this is really, really, really old. And this umbrella is fully adjustable, which is so you can move it all around and angle it for the sun. And also, let's take a bit of time to look at these beautiful terracotta horses. These are amazing. They've still got some of the colour on there, or maybe they're bronze, maybe that's why some of the colour is still on there, but they are absolutely divine. And just the detail in this wagon, look, it's still got some of this kind of like hanging tokens off the side. You've got all the wheels. Absolutely amazing. Pretty cool. And they've also found alongside the army, I think they found some acrobats. So they found like a strongman and a gymnast. So that's just kind of hinting at the other things that this tomb has to offer when it's fully excavated. Yeah, so that's the terracotta army. Here we go. So we're going from the Qin Dynasty, which takes us up to 200 BC. Sorry. To the Tang Dynasty. So this is the Tang Dynasty, a very loopy map, again, against the map of modern China. So the Tang Dynasty was from 1618 to 1906. There we go. So that's roughly where we are at the moment. And we're going to look at one of my favourite types of Chinese ceramic, which is called Sankai ware, which is from the Tang Dynasty, and it is mostly used for grave goods. You don't really get this as like tableware, especially not in China. So these are kind of like a scaled down version of the terracotta army. Nobody since obviously has made something like the terracotta army because one, it's very, very costly, and two, it's a big undertaking. But people were still buried with things that were meant to serve them in the afterlife. So you're essentially getting that person ready to live the life that they've lived in real life into the afterlife, because there still is this concept of the afterlife at this time. Later on, with the influences of Buddhism and with the kind of the Confucian ideas that come in later on, this kind of idea of the afterlife is kind of done away with, and you get these less ornate tombs. So that's why you don't really get any of these big grand sculptures in burial mounds after this. Yeah, so what you generally find buried are kind of figurines of servants, animals, entertainers, and kind of things that denote wealth and will look after the deceased in the afterlife. These two here as well are grave guardians, or fierce earth spirits. And what I hadn't realised was that these weren't to like defend the deceased. They were made to protect the living from the wandering souls of the deceased. So it was essentially to make sure that ghosts stayed in the grave and didn't come out and haunt you, which I was quite cool. I didn't realise that. So these are a lot smaller. So they're not life-size. They kind of range from like 10 centimetres to 1 metre, 20 centimetres. So, you know, not tiny, but not huge. And some of the styles show contact with other cultures. You get, particularly through trade along the Silk Road, you do get people coming in contact with people from the Middle East. And you do get a kind of a lot of these figurines modelled after who look like they would come from the Middle East. They're wearing those clothes, and quite often they're kind of bringing in ornate goods, and it's to kind of show the wealth of the person, that they were able to trade along the Silk Road and get these rarefied things. So these pieces are collected widely in the West, but not in China, because their association with death is kind of still considered a bit unlucky. Be a bit like us collecting bits of gravestone or something. It's maybe a bit weird. I love the colour. There's quite a few of these in the Burrow collection as well. When it reopens, there's some lovely grave guardians and a few horses. And I just love the drippiness of the colour. I think the drippiness of the colour is what really does it for me. And that's made by, they use a lead glaze. So lead creates this beautiful white colour, and then over the top they drip these other pigments that create these colours. So it's kind of yellow ochre, copper carbonate, and later on a bit of cobalt carbonate, which would be particularly expensive, and that creates a blue colour. So the copper is the green, and kind of the yellow ochre creates this brown and yellow colour. I love the freedom of the coloration. See, here's another two. So here's this lovely horse, which is very beautifully decorated in blue. There we go. So this is kind of a bit more precise, but you still get some of these drips. And that's quite often because when you apply these pigments, one, they're very runny, and two, a lead glaze can be quite runny as well, which causes the colour to run. But I just think it's gorgeous. And then also we've got this lovely camel here, which again kind of hints at trade with the Middle East. Been quite scary. They haven't got any eyeballs, and they both got kind of their mouths open, so I don't really know what's happening there, but I think they're really cool. And then we've got two lovely maidens here. I love the detail on their dresses, and I think the flowing of the colour works really well, and kind of makes their dresses look kind of like very fine and very floaty and silky, and they're lovely. This is also one of my favourite examples. These are kind of dancing servant girls, and although they're made of this very hard ceramic material, I think the way they're kind of like waving their arms, they look like they're moving, they look like they're dancing. There's a great fluidity there. I think they're really, really nice. Yeah, I think that you see the kind of the coloration hasn't stayed with them so well, so maybe they've not been in such nice conditions, or maybe they're a bit older. So you can kind of see what the clay would look like underneath. There's a bit more colouring left on these ones at the front. I just think they're really, really elegant and gorgeous. There we go. So now we're Tang Dynasty. We're now moving into the Song Dynasty. And so we had kind of two phases of the Song Dynasty. You've got the Northern Song when they've got all of this bit. And then later they had to retreat and just kind of move into the Southern Song. The guys up here kind of booted them out. They had to go down here. So the Song Dynasty is kind of the golden age of Chinese art, and we're kind of moving away from kind of these things that we're finding in graves, these things that have just been preserved, into kind of things that more everyday people have used. We're kind of seeing things that depict the times around them, and also landscapes. So we're going to focus on one of the emperors here. The Song Dynasty in general conquered a lot of the surrounding territories, but later was defeated and it was quite politically turbulent. But life for the citizens was vibrant and wealthy. There was the introduction of paper money, there was more wealth around, there was a lot of trade. But we're not going to look at the whole Song dynasty. First of all, we're going to focus on Emperor Zong, who was the 8th emperor of the Northern Song dynasty, so that's when it's really big, and he reigned from 1100 to 1126. So he never expected to be an emperor because he was born 6th in line for the throne. And he was raised as an intellectual and art lover. He wasn't really schooled to be an emperor or to be a leader from a young age. It just kind of happened to him. So he wasn't so good at the emperor bit. He had the looming threat of the Jin Empire invading from the north, which was kind of a constant threat there. And eventually, to get out of his rule, he faked a stroke, named his son's successor, abdicated and ran away. He was later captured. And it was thought he was very superstitious throughout his reign as well. So, because he was raised as an intellectual and an art lover, he invested in and was very influential over the arts during his reign, and he kind of oversaw a change in Chinese art that would kind of continue and echo down the years. It was a real game changer. And he was also a big painter himself. This is one of his pieces, Court Ladies Preparing Silk. So this is one that he's done himself. And he's got these ladies, lovely ladies of the court in all their finery, and this is the day that they're hard at work. So apparently the ladies of the court would do this once a year, and it was kind of all about kind of a metaphor for the kingdom being in order and everybody having their place. And also silk was one of China's biggest exports at the moment. And in fact, this emperor was paying off the Jin in the north who were threatening to invade. He was kind of paying them off with silk, just being like, all right, take this, please leave us alone. So this was kind of how the Song dynasty got a lot of their power, was through this and high demand for silk. So it's quite, so as we learned last week, you read these pieces from right to left. So it's kind of counterintuitive to what we would normally do. Because obviously we read left to right, but when we're looking at these, you want to look right to left. So we're starting off with the women beating the silk. They're kind of hitting down on it. This lady's she's getting ready to do her work. She's rolling her sleeves up. She's going to get down and do some hard work. And then we move to where people are spinning it. They're spinning, they're weaving it into lovely thread and then weaving it. And this lady's also, she's keeping the fire going to heat this iron here that they're using to iron out the silk. There we go. So it seems like a real team activity. You've kind of got the younger girl helping out, you've got the little girl playing down below. And what I think is most interesting about this piece is just kind of the focus on the people and the activity. We're not looking at where they are. We're not looking at kind of the beauty of their surrounding. We're looking at them doing their activity. The only things that are included are the people and then the objects that they are directly working with. So we're really focusing on the activity in this piece. So this is another painting that the emperor did. So remember we talked about him being 6th in line to the throne and never expecting to be the emperor. So he was very superstitious throughout his life because he was a bit like, well, it's kind of been fated that this would fall to me. God, you've put me here, you've got to help me out. So he's kind of always looking for signs, and he paid people to go all over his country and to look and watch for signs. And this was a day that he personally commemorated because it was when a flock of cranes landed on the imperial palace. So cranes were seen as messengers of the gods. So to have a whole load of them land on the imperial palace where the emperor lives, the emperor is the ruler, he's appointed by God, it's a really good sign for him. It makes him look really good. So he's decided to kind of commemorate it, just kind of like seal himself in there. It's kind of like, yes, don't worry, you're meant to be here, this is what's meant to happen. Because if he doesn't have all these ruling skills, you can imagine he was feeling quite lost a lot of the time. So here's the full scroll. So there it is with the image, and then here it is with some writing beside it, kind of maybe commemorating the day, explaining what happened. I really like, again, as we saw kind of a few weeks ago in the Japanese lesson that we had, this use of negative space here for the cloud. So he's just left the scroll bare, but we can tell that that's meant to be a cloud, and I think that's really lovely. And then last but not least, this is one of his paintings of rocks. So apparently rocks with holes in them are very auspicious, they're very lucky as well. And towards the end of his reign, he had people go out and find these rocks and bring them to the imperial palace to create a rock garden. And then he spent a lot of time recording and drawing these rocks. So you can see he's really kind of investing a lot of time and kind of reassuring himself that things are going to be okay, he's doing all the right things. Maybe not by ruling, but he's surrounding himself with all these kind of lucky talismans. Must have been quite a difficult place to be in charge of a big old empire when you're not prepared. But I think the way he's captured the texture on these rocks is really nice, really lovely. And again, we've got this adjoining calligraphy. So kind of the big change that he oversaw was, before his reign, you kind of had court painters who would paint stuff. And the stuff they would paint would be a bit like this. This is from the Tang Dynasty, this illustration in particular. It's very brightly coloured. A lot of these pieces had a kind of a moral message. And if they didn't have a moral message, they would be decorative. So it would be kind of pretty fans, pretty scrolls, pretty things for the wall, maybe kind of something depicting a moralising tale. And the people that were doing these paintings weren't really viewed as artists. They were kind of thought of as like craftspeople. So they weren't particularly high status. Because I suppose when we think of artists, we think of, oh wow, we really focus on the individual. We think about, oh, they must have something really special that no one else can do. Whereas these people were like, no, you teach them how to do it and then they do it, that sort of thing. So they didn't have a big reputation. They weren't highly regarded because there was a whole load of them doing the same stuff. So essentially, they'd paint what they were told to paint, and they would kind of work together in a workshop. So you weren't really trained and then you went off and did your own thing. Skilled painters from around the country would kind of be recruited, and you'd come into the workshop, train as an apprentice in this style that you would then make things for the imperial court. But under Zong, that changed. He invested in these people who came to be known as scholar painters. So they weren't like these craftspeople. These were men of letters. They studied the Confucian classics. They learned a lot of philosophy. They learned a lot of poetry, and a lot of this work was inspired by calligraphy. So they used the tools of writing, they used the tools of calligraphy, they used the same brushes, they used the ink. So they're not using the colour anymore, they're not using kind of these pigments mixed with water, they're using ink stones and calligraphy brushes. And even the verb to paint changed. They didn't paint these paintings were written. And you can see here kind of the calligraphy here is very dominant in the picture. You've got this very complicated landscape with lots of things going on, but you've also got all this writing and these seals in there. They're very integral. So you had to pass the Emperor's calligraphy exam to even train to be one of these scholars. It was definitely a path that you went on, and you had to go through all this education before you become a master. They used 5 different shades of ink. As you can see here, there's maybe 5 different tones here. So they used heavy, lots of ink, which I imagine is kind of this sort of bit, light, dry, thirsty, and white. So I imagine that white is kind of areas of bare scroll, and then you might have moved through these shades to darker. So these people they had a more elevated status. They were looked on as academics and artists, not kind of craftspeople. So there was kind of an assumption that you were high-born, very knowledgeable, very wise. People also began to sign their work. So this is the first time that people are signing their work. So it's being attributed to an individual artist, an individual master. Not just anyone can do this. People were free to kind of paint what they wanted a bit more. They weren't so attached to court. They could go off and do their own sort of projects and bring them back and share ideas with each other. The scenes that they painted were naturalistic, they were realistic, but they were also idealized. So you'd go out and you paint the countryside, but you'd paint the countryside at its absolute prime. And this is when people really got into painting these beautiful landscapes of mountains and rivers and these beautiful clouds that you see that are quite typical of Chinese art. So this one here is by Fan Quan, and this is called Sitting Alone in the Mountains. So this is really quite a complex thing. We've got lots of different shades going on. You've got all these beautiful suggestions of trees through the cloud. This lovely waterfall here, a little town down here, a little bridge. It's there's loads and loads of little details happening in here. It's a highly intricate work. And then we've also got this one here, which is Dancing and Singing Peasants Returning from Work by Yuan. So here we go, we've got these peasants coming along here. And I think this piece as well really shows off how much like calligraphy this is. A lot of these strokes are very, you can tell they're done with a brush, and it looks a lot more graphic than these other pieces. I just think it's very, very lovely. It looks very serene. These guys are running happily home after a day of work. That's how nice for them. Lovely. So just have a wee look at calligraphy, because understanding calligraphy is really key to understanding this change in art, but also through understanding Chinese art in general. So this is a beautiful piece of calligraphy by one of the calligraphy masters called Hoi Su, I think, who was a bit later. He's probably from, is he Tang Dynasty? He is Tang Dynasty, so he's a bit earlier than this. So Chinese calligraphy is one of the oldest surviving pictorial languages and one of the longest continuing traditions of pictorial languages. It's one of the longest continuous traditions, so it's very unchanged. Like any art, it's gone through different styles, but actually the symbols themselves are very preserved in time. There's a lot less change in pictorial languages than there is in I don't know what, a non-pictorial language like English or French or something like that, where more words are made up, because you got this alphabet that you can put together to make things, whereas you'd need a whole new symbol created for pictorial languages. So a lot of the symbols really are a snapshot of time from when they were created. So really understanding calligraphy is key to understanding Chinese art. So I feel like I don't really understand calligraphy that much, so my understanding of Chinese art is probably very limited. So the brushwork and the fluidity that you need for calligraphy also applies to a lot of these beautiful drawings. So this is Hai Su, and then this other piece is Mi Fu. So we can see quite a different style there. This one is very fluid, almost looks like it's dancing. It looks maybe like a ribbon blowing in the breeze. It's very gorgeous. And then this is a lot more, feels a lot more confident. It's very bold. The lines are much thicker. Maybe using drier ink. There's definitely a speed here. I really like that. And then this is this is a drawing by Mi Fu with some of his calligraphy here. So the calligraphy becomes very important to the drawing. The calligraphy will tell us something about the drawing. It will definitely be adding to it, and it wouldn't be the same image without the calligraphy. Obviously we can't read it, so it's quite hard for us to understand that, but that is what I've been told. So here's the full composition with the writing in it. And I love these seals. I think they dot around some beautiful colour. So you can see how the relationship between the marks and the calligraphy, and the marks are used particularly in these trees and in these mountains, especially in the grass. You can see that fluidity there. So bear with me on this, because I know that most of us cannot read these languages. Great on you if you can. Maybe you can tell us a bit more about it. That'd be really good. So we've gone from the northern Zong, They were then chased south, and they just had the southern Zong. It's two different spellings. Sorry, it's the same place. So now we're in the southern Song dynasty, which is politically and economically weak, but as we've just discussed, culturally is an absolute golden age. And this is a piece made later in the Song dynasty, so they've already kind of had to come south, and they know they're politically weak. They know that they're under threat from the north, and not only from the Jin, who've already taken a lot of lands off them, but also from Genghis Khan, who is completely dominating most of the world at this point and creating one of the biggest empires ever. So there's lots of rumours flying around about kind of this amazing empire, the fierceness of the Mongol army. The Jin above them are already being attacked by the Mongol armies. So, you know, there's a threat in the air. So this is one of a big masterpieces called the Nine Dragons Scroll by Chen Rong from 1244. And in this piece we've got, it's really long, I couldn't fit it all on the screen, so I'm going to try and show you it as we go. So imagine this is all unfurling in front of you with some really bad PowerPoint effects I put in. So we've got 9 dragons that are thought to represent Imperial China, and then we've got kind of all these clouds and whirlpools are kind of meant to kind of represent all the looming threats around them, which I think is quite a nice interpretation. So we've got 1 dragon, 2 dragon, he's hovering above the clouds, we've got some writing here, we've got a wind flying in, he's kind of always hiding, he's crouching. Another one, he's kind of swimming through the mist. Oh, what's happening? Who's going to come and get us next? Are we doing the right thing? Then we've got these 2 here, kind of under threat from being sucked into this whirlpool. So maybe this whirlpool is war. Maybe it's kind of the threat of all these armies in the north coming to get everything you've built. I love the softness of this. I feel like, especially with the contrast of the kind of the quite dark detail of these dragons, I think this swirl of the whirlpool is gorgeous. There we go, we've got a few more, we've got big waves coming in, the dragon's kind of like, woo, I'm getting lost under the waves. Here we've got another one kind of running from the waves as well, we've got more wind and waves kind of sucking him in. They're not looking like very fierce dragons, are they? They look a bit, woo, what's happening? Ooh, what's happening? Here we go, and here's the end as well. So there we go. So this one looks a bit more calm, but he definitely doesn't look like he's out fighting anyone. He's kind of lying down, he's coiled up, maybe he's hiding underneath this bank of cloud. It's a very uncertain picture. I think these aren't fierce commanding dragons that control everything. They're definitely on the back foot. So yeah, so it's thought that this maybe gives us a bit of insight into kind of what's happening in China at this point. Also, it's really nice. Dragons are cool. So next we're moving into the Yuan dynasty. So Imperial China fell to the invaders from the north, the Mongols, and China became part of the world's biggest empire, the Mongol Empire. So China was occupied by the Mongol forces, who installed their own emperor, Kublai Khan, who was the grandson of Genghis Khan. So we were here. This is what we had, and then now this is now China. This is the Yuan dynasty. So this is the bit that the Kublai Khan operates. And then this is the entirety of the Mongol Empire in 1289. So it's pretty huge. We're coming right up into Eastern Europe here. It's pretty massive there. We've got a huge hunk of the world. So we've gone from down here all the way up round here. We're now talking about all this area. So they installed their new emperor, Kublai Khan, and to try and get the people on side, because you know, if you've got a country to rule, you kind of want people to like you, and you're kind of on a back foot because you've just come in and taken over. So they built a new capital city, not in the north, but in the very south, which is now Beijing. And they built this new capital city for the emperor to live in, and they built lots and lots of very grand, very traditional Chinese architecture. So they're kind of trying to really get people on side by being like, no, we're going to rule it kind of in the spirit of your people. We're not an invading army. You know, we're just your next great emperor, and we're going to make you very rich. And they did. There was very good trade because the Mongols had links right across the Middle East throughout their empire, right into Eastern Europe. And this led to lots of new influences on Chinese culture across this time. So, although there were kind of all these new influences coming in, the last big school of great painters, the scholar painters who kind of really set the tone for Chinese art, were not part of the Yuan Dynasty regime, because all the kind of the scholar class, all the government working people, all the educated guys that knew how to all write this stuff down were very under suspicion because they thought they'd be loyal, wouldn't be loyal to the new emperor. So they were banned from all government jobs. They didn't want them having too much power. So many of these scholars, many of these artists, fled to the countryside. They were like, oh, not working for you, can't get a good job. I'm going to go live out in the countryside and kind of really inhabit a lot of this Confucian philosophy. So they fled to the countryside and lived alongside ordinary working folk. How romantic. And lived alongside farmers and fishermen. And they began a new style called the Art of Misery. I don't know how much of a formal title that is. It is the title that I saw in the documentary, so I'm going to go with it. But not all artists fled to the countryside. We're going to start off by looking at the lovely Zhao Mengfu, who initially tried to work for the Mongol Empire, and he did quite a bit of brown nosing, I think is only what you can call this, because he did this series of paintings called Horses and Groomsmen, and he's deliberately painting these very steppe-like Mongolian horses. They're very short, they're very strong. So he's really trying to butter up the new Mongol rulers by kind of painting something that they're very proud of. The Mongols were absolutely deadly on horseback. That's kind of why they were, one of the reasons they were so good at winning was because they were absolutely deadly and really well trained on their horses and absolutely lethal. So he did this series of paintings where this groomsman is actually based on a self-portrait of himself. So that's, you know, here he is literally serving the beautiful Mongol horses. He's kind of been like, this is a symbol of you, this is a symbol of me, I'm gonna work with you. Here's another one. So again, you've got all these beautiful seals, all this beautiful calligraphy, and he's kind of returned to that court style of painting. He's not doing flowing landscapes and things. It's very much focused on the people, it's focused on the action, and it's focused on colour as well. And they are really lovely, really lovely. Here's another one. Again, very much in that court style. Really lovely. Great colours. And here is one of his biggest works, which I haven't written down the title of. Oh, that's a real. I'll post it in below. Here is. So this is a scroll that's going this way along, and then this way. There we go. I've tried to split it up so we can see it all. And here he is. He's showing herdsmen looking after these horses. So again, he's really playing up to them. He's painting what they really like. He's painting these horses. So you've got this guy kind of taking them into water, giving them some baths, really looking after them, taking them out for a dry, you know, nourishing the army. This is probably telling you something about it. But then he was like, this isn't working, and he moved out to the countryside and joined the other painters of misery. And later he was quite ashamed for trying to work for the Mongols and for doing all that brown nosing. And he began working on this style that we now know as misery. And I think the one is a lot rougher, it's a lot more free, it's a lot more calligraphic, more like that calligraphy. So this piece is called Twin Pines Level Distance, and you'll notice there's a lot more sparse, there's a lot less on the page, it's a lot more airy, and the subject is a lot less grand. They're not painting beautiful landscapes that are really complex and full of all these tiny little details. They're really focusing down on one detail of nature. They've got two trees and some rocks, and he's painted it in quite a kind of a gestural style. So it's definitely a lot more kind of, they've fallen from grace. They're not painting these grand masterpieces anymore. They're a lot more humble. They're painting the simple beauties of nature. So this is one that he did out in the countryside. And then this is another one here. So this is elegant rocks and sparse trees. So again, he's kind of really coming down. He's not looking up and out at this grand landscape. He's looking down and focusing in on this, the elegant simplicity of this rock and some sparse trees. They're not beautiful trees, they're just sparse. And you can really see the different tones of the ink here, this really dark colour, kind of the more thirsty tones. And it is a lot more, you can really tell that it's ink and you can see a lot more of the brushwork. I think it's really, really lovely. Yeah, very, very nice. Yeah, it's not a happy subject, it's just a rock. It's just painting a rock. So now we're kind of, oh dear, there we go, we're coming down to one of the later, so this is kind of one of the main guys from the Years of Misery. So he's after the last guy. This is Nizan. So Nizan spent 20 years living on a houseboat doing painting, calligraphy and poetry. And he really saw all these things as like the same sides, like different faces of the same thing. He saw painting, calligraphy and poetry all as the one. And he was a key figure in developing this art of misery. So at this time, outcast artists, calligraphers and musicians would kind of get together and work collaboratively over an evening, a bit like getting together for a wee dinner party, but except the musicians would play, the painters would paint, and the calligraphers would draw as well. So they were all kind of like, you know, feeding off each other's inspiration, working together, encouraging each other, and they called these elegant gatherings. And kind of they started working on the same pieces. So maybe two painters would work on the same piece. Maybe somebody would paint on somebody's calligraphy. Maybe someone would write on somebody's painting. So they're all kind of like feeding off each other and kind of all working collaboratively to keep these skills and these traditions going. So this piece is called Six Gentlemen. So this is a kind of a subject that he returned to many times, but this is one of the most treasured iterations. And it's kind of meant to present, you know, kind of maybe these six people standing together. They're staying strong, they're standing tall in their tradition. So kind of maybe he's seeing himself and some of his peers in this composition, you know. Maybe over here, this is the Imperial China. This is where the Yuan Dynasty is, where the Mongols are invading. And here they are, they've gone off and they've isolated themselves and they're standing tall and they're just, you know, doing their thing. And what's really interesting here is a lot of these works were from their imagination. So they were conjured up from the ideal forms of nature, which to me doesn't really make much sense because, you know, these artists who normally live in the city have now gone out and they're living in the countryside, and now they're not painting what they see around them, they're working from their imagination, drawing the ideal form. So maybe they've spent so much time in nature that now they can conjure up it really clearly into their mind's eye. But to me, it doesn't really make sense to not paint what you're seeing when you're out and amongst it. But that's what they did. So especially this piece is done completely from the artist's imagination, because this piece of calligraphy here says that he painted it for a friend, and he arrived at his friend's house and his friend greeted him with a lamp and ushered him in and asked him to paint him this work. So Nizam painted it by lamplight when he was very tired and hungry from his travels. So that's how we know that he really made it up from his imagination. And I think that's really an essential piece of text. I'd also like to say I got this from a BBC documentary. I don't know 100% what this says, but that is the rough estimate. So it was nice of him to paint it for his pal when he was really tired. But it just goes to show that a lot of these bits of text give us a bit more information about what is happening around these paintings, what's happening at that time. There we go. And that's the end of today. So if you join us again next week, we'll be looking at kind of 12th century onwards. So thank you for being with me today, and thanks for listening.